This is video podcast 38 from LearningRadiology.com. Video flashcards most commons in musculoskeletal imaging. Hello, I'm William Herring from Albert Einstein Medical Center in Philadelphia. This podcast is either an audio-only, video-only, or a combined audio and video podcast. The way it works is that on side one of each card, there'll be a question, for example, for what American president was the Lincoln Memorial named? And then on side two, there'll be the question repeated at the top and the answer, Abraham Lincoln. So let's get started. What is the most common bone in the wrist to fracture? The scaphoid. What is the most common part of the scaphoid to undergo avascular necrosis? The proximal pole. What is the most common bone in the wrist to dislocate? The lunate. What is the most common type of dislocation of the hip? A posterior dislocation. What is the most common type of dislocation of the shoulder? An anterior dislocation. What is the most common skeletal manifestation of multiple myeloma? Generalized osteoporosis. What is the most common location for Paget's disease? The pelvis. What is the most common bone tumor to complicate Paget's disease? An osteosarcoma. What is the most common parathyroid abnormality leading to primary hyperparathyroidism? A parathyroid adenoma. What is the most common parathyroid abnormality leading to secondary hyperparathyroidism? Hyperplasia of the parathyroid glands. What is the most common cause of protrusio acetabuli? Rheumatoid arthritis. What is the most common bone of origin for a Ewing sarcoma? The femur. What is the most common benign tumor of the ribs? Fibrous dysplasia. What is the most common malignant tumor of the ribs? Metastatic disease. What is the most common site of osteochondritis dissecans? The medial femoral condyle. What is the most common location of a humeral fracture in a child? A supracondylar fracture. What is the most common location of a humeral fracture in an adult? A fracture of the surgical neck of the humerus. What is the most commonly missed fracture of the elbow? In a child, a supracondylar fracture. In an adult, a fracture of the radial head. What is the most common site for a stress fracture of bone? Which bone? The proximal tibia. What are the most common metatarsals to undergo stress fractures? The second or third metatarsals. What is the most common benign bone tumor? An osteochondroma. What is the most common malignant bone tumor? Metastatic bone disease. What is the most common primary malignant tumor of bone? Multiple myeloma. What is the most common solitary primary malignant tumor of bone? An osteosarcoma. What is the most common bone tumor in the hand? An enchondroma. What is the most common tumor that originates in a growing epiphysis? A chondroblastoma. What is the most common tumor arising in a closed epiphysis, an adult? A giant cell tumor. What is the most common tumor of the hand? A ganglion cyst. What is the most common location of an osteoblastoma? The posterior elements of the vertebral bodies, the lamina and the pedicles. What is the most common location of a synovial sarcoma, synovioma? The lower extremity, the knee or the hip. What is the most common location of a chordoma? The sacrum and coccyx. What is the most common site for leukemia in bone? The skull and orbits. What is the most common location of a simple bone cyst, unicameral bone cyst? The proximal humeral metaphysis. What is the most common crystalline arthropathy? Calcium pyrophosphate deposition disease. What is the most common site for synovial osteochondromatosis? The knee. If you like this podcast, then you'll love podcast 15, Cardiac Most Commons, podcast 21, Chest Most Commons, or podcast 25, GI Most Common.